In 1975, one company invented the future of photography. And then, they spent the next 30 years trying to assassinate their own child. This isn't a story about a dinosaur getting left behind by technology. This is a story about an empire that saw the future perfectly, owned the patent to rule it, and then chose suicide out of a single psychological fear. I am the Shadow Archivist. Today, we open the strangest case file in business history, the death of Kodak. We need to dissect how the fear of cannibalization turned a giant into dust. To understand the motive for this murder, you first have to understand the sheer weight of the victim. Rochester, New York, in the mid-1970s, wasn't just a city. It was a fortress of yellow and red. The air itself seemed to smell of silver halide and gelatin, the smell of money. At the center of this empire sat Eastman Kodak. They weren't just a tech company. They were the custodians of human history. If you got married, if your child took their first step, if you went on vacation, you paid a tax to Kodak to prove it happened. They held a virtual monopoly on memory itself. The Kodak moment wasn't just a slogan. It was a psychological toll booth. Here is how the machine worked. It is what business historians call the razor and blade model. But let's look at it through the lens of the street. Imagine a drug dealer who gives you the pipe for free because he knows you'll have to come back every single week to buy the product to put inside it. Kodak sold cameras the pipes, often at break-even prices. They didn't care if they made money on the hardware. Why? Because once you had the camera, you were trapped in their ecosystem. You needed the film. Then you needed the chemicals to develop the film. Then you needed the paper to print the film. It was a river of chemicals that turned into a river of cash. For every dollar Kodak spent manufacturing that little roll of plastic, they could charge a premium that would make an oil baron blush. Their gross margins on film were hovering near 70% or 80%. In the world of finance, that isn't a profit margin. That is a license to print currency. This silver river flowed directly into Rochester, building schools, funding orchestras, and employing generations of families. It created a culture of extreme comfort and absolute certainty. When you are making that much money doing exactly what you are doing, the idea of changing anything doesn't just look risky. It looks insane. But in December 1975, in a quiet lab down the hall, a young engineer named Stephen Sasson built a bomb. It didn't look like a bomb. It looked like a Frankenstein's monster of electronic scraps. It was the size of a toaster, weighed nearly 8 pounds, and was held together by duct tape and optimism. It used a cassette tape to record data. This was the world's first digital camera. Sasson took a picture of a lab technician. It took 23 seconds to record the image to the tape. Then, he took the contraption to a playback unit, and the grainy, black and white face of the technician appeared on a television screen. No film, no chemicals, no waiting, no silver river. Sasson, young and naive to the politics of the boardroom, thought he had just handed his bosses the keys to the future. He scheduled a demonstration for the executives, the lords of the yellow box. He walked into the room, presented the device, and explained the concept. Photography without the paper, Photography as information, not chemistry. The room went silent. But it wasn't the silence of awe. It was the silence of a landlord, realizing his tenant had just invented a way to live rent-free.
The evidence is authentic.
They asked him a simple question, one that reveals the fatal flaw in their thinking. Steve, tell us about the quality. Is it as good as film? Sasson was honest. No, it's terrible. But Moore's law says it will get better. In 15 to 20 years, this will rival film. They looked at the grainy image. Then they looked at their ledgers, overflowing with billions of dollars from chemical film sales. They didn't see an invention. They saw a parasite. They saw something that would cannibalize their own children. One executive reportedly told him, "That's cute, but don't tell anyone about it." And with that sentence, the fuse was lit. They had seen the iceberg 20 years away, but instead of turning the ship, they decided to forbid the crew from talking about the ice. The tragedy of Eastman Kodak is not that they were blind. It is that they could see perfectly, but they refused to believe what their eyes were telling them. They didn't just shove Steven Sasson's toaster camera into a closet and forget about it. They actually patented it. They owned the very thing that would eventually kill them. But here is where the logic of the boardroom clashes with the logic of survival. To the executives on the top floor, the digital camera represented a financial horror story. Remember the razor and blade model? The camera is the razor. The film is the blade. You make your fortune on the blades. Digital photography broke the machine. It was a razor that never needed new blades. If Kodak sold you a digital camera, they got your money once. That's it. No film to buy on Tuesday. No developing costs on Thursday. No prints to order on Saturday. They looked at the math, and it was terrifying. Selling a roll of film was like selling pure profit. Margins of nearly 80%. Selling a digital camera was a brutal street fight with Japanese electronics companies scraping by on margins of maybe 5% or 10%. To switch from film to digital was to voluntarily trade a dollar for a dime. So, they made a choice. They decided to manage the decline. They treated the digital camera like a dangerous secret, hoping to squeeze every last drop of juice out of the chemical lemon before the world changed. This is the cannibalization fear. Imagine you own a thriving restaurant that sells only expensive steaks. Your chef comes to you and says, "I've invented a pill that makes people not hungry anymore." You don't put that pill on the menu. If you do, you cannibalize your own business. You eat your own profits. So, you bury the pill. But there was a problem. Kodak wasn't the only restaurant in town. While Kodak was busy protecting its steak business, companies like Sony, Canon, and Nikon, who didn't have a massive film monopoly to protect, looked at the digital pill and saw an opportunity. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, the hidden engine of Kodak's demise began to turn. The irony is cruel. Kodak actually spent billions on digital research during this time. They weren't asleep. They were paralyzed. Every time a Kodak engineer came up with a digital innovation, the marketing department asked, "How does this help us sell more film?" If the answer was, it doesn't, the project was strangled in the crib. They built hybrid cameras that used film but let you view images on a screen. A Frankenstein product nobody wanted. They built digital kiosks in drugstores, trying to force people to print their digital photos on paper. They were desperately trying to force the square peg of the future into the round hole of the past. They were addicts. The revenue from film was the drug, and they couldn't endure the withdrawal symptoms of switching to a new business model. Then came the 2010 problem, except it arrived in the late 1990s. The dam broke. The technology that Sasson predicted Moore's law caught up. Digital sensors became cheap. Storage became vast. The internet arrived, allowing people to share photos instantly without ever touching a piece of paper. Suddenly, the Kodak moment didn't need Kodak anymore. The collapse was physical and violent. It wasn't a slow leak. It was a cliff. In 1996, Kodak was the fourth most valuable brand in the United States. They were invincible. Their stock was trading at over $90 a share. They were the Google of their day. By the mid-2000s, the Silver River had turned into dust. Film sales didn't just dip, they evaporated. In the span of a few years, the market for film dropped by 90%. It was as if the oil in the ground suddenly turned to water. Kodak tried to pivot. They finally released consumer digital cameras. And truthfully, they were good cameras. For a brief moment, Kodak was actually a top seller of digital cameras in America. But remember the math. Trading $1 for a dime. They were selling millions of digital cameras, but they were losing money on every single unit. They were bleeding to death from 1,000 cuts. They had the sales, but they didn't have the profit engine anymore. The engine was film, and the engine was dead. The factories in Rochester, once humming 24 hours a day, began to go dark. The chemicals stopped flowing. The layoffs began, not in the hundreds, but in the tens of thousands. The fortress was crumbling. The king of photography was standing in the middle of a burning castle, holding a patent for the fire extinguisher that he had refused to manufacture because he was afraid it would ruin the carpet. In January 2012, the final bill arrived. Eastman Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The Yellow Giant, the company that had once employed over 145,000 people and whose stock was considered safer than government bonds, was officially insolvent. They were kicked off the New York Stock Exchange. The stock that once traded at $90 was now worth pennies, literally less than the cost of the plastic roll they used to sell. But the true end wasn't on a spreadsheet. It was on the streets of Rochester. To pay their debts, they had to sell their patents, the very intellectual property Stephen Sasson and others had created. They sold the keys to the digital kingdom to Apple, Google, and Facebook for a fraction of what they were worth. They were pawning the crown jewels just to pay the electric bill. Then came the physical demolition. There is a famous video of Building 9 in Kodak Park, a massive facility where the film was made. In 2015, they filled it with dynamite and imploded it. In seconds, the concrete cathedral of the 20th century turned into a cloud of dust. It is a violent image, but it is the perfect metaphor for their strategy. By trying to preserve everything, they saved nothing. Here is the cruelest irony of all. 3 months after Kodak went bankrupt, Facebook purchased a tiny startup called Instagram for $1 billion. Instagram had 13 employees. Kodak had 140 years of history. But Instagram understood what Kodak had forgotten.
But memory.
Kodak thought they were in the film business. They weren't. They were in the memory business. People didn't love film. They loved the picture. They loved the moment. Film was just the delivery truck. When a faster truck arrived the internet, Kodak refused to get on board because they owned a garage full of the old trucks. They fell victim to the ultimate paradox of success. The more you have to lose, the harder it is to move. Kodak's leadership looked at the digital camera and saw a threat to their margins. They should have seen the lifeboat. They believed that if they ignored the future would wait for them. But time is the only market that never closes, and it waits for no one. The lesson of the yellow box is harsh but necessary. In business, and perhaps in life, your biggest enemy isn't the competitor trying to storm your castle. It is the walls you built to protect yourself. Kodak hugged their cash cow so tight, they suffocated it. They chose the safety of the known over the risk of the new, proving once and for all that the most dangerous place to be is standing still in a moving world. We have dissected the anatomy of a giant that forgot how to walk. We have seen how a monopoly on memory became a paralysis of fear. We walked the halls of Rochester and saw that gold can turn to lead if you refuse to polish it with innovation. The story of Kodak is a warning written in red ink. Survival is not about protecting what you were. It is about becoming what you must be. Because in the ledger of history, every debt must eventually be paid.